You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Episode 81, The Paradox.
Welcome to The Paradox with your attending, Dr. Eric Larson. He is a practicing anesthesiologist and clinical assistant professor at Michigan State University College of Human Medicine. Listen in as he takes you behind the scenes of what practicing medicine in today's ever-changing world is like with another doctor. The Paradox is a fun and accidentally informative show for physicians, patients, or anyone who has ever found themselves in a waiting room.
Welcome to The Paradox. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Larson. Thank you for joining me as we explore the U.S. medical system in a fun, informative format through expert analysis. Today's expert is Dr. Niran Al-Agba. Dr. Al-Agba is a general pediatrician who does pediatrics in Silverdale, Washington at Silverdale Pediatrics, and she has a very curious case that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about child abuse, and specifically the process for removing children from homes. And this is specific, of course, to the state of Washington, but most of the procedures and the powers granted to the authorities to remove children from homes is very similar from state to state. I mean, there are some differences. I think it's probably the case that it is not called CPS or Child Protective Services in every state, but there is some agency that is given the power to remove children who are deemed to be in unsafe or dangerous conditions. It's also fair to say, I think, that most people are supportive of protecting children because they are unable to protect themselves, especially when those who are charged with protecting them, namely the parents or their guardians, are doing a poor job or actually harming them. Now, where you draw the lines, and what is dangerous, and I think there's obviously that's the normal debate we have in civil society, but I think it's reasonable to have these sorts of agencies. The question, of course, comes down to how much power they have, what checks are there to their power, how can you redress grievances, or I guess you should say, how do you adjudicate disputes? So if you have two people who dispute whether there was actually abuse that occurred, sometimes it's not obvious. And what we're going to talk about today, Dr. Al-Agba had a patient who, in her opinion, and from at least all the evidence and the investigation that's occurred afterwards and publicly, pretty clearly was not abuse. And the actions of the CPS and the physician who was in charge of qualifying this case as abuse not only went unpunished, but sort of carried on. But it is interesting that they were given these extraordinary powers, and they caused a lot of disruption in the family. It's a scary thing if you're a parent and you worry about things that you shouldn't worry about. I think there was a time when I was a kid, back in the 80s, when there was the whole concern about kids getting kidnapped by, people offer them candy and getting into vans and getting driven off. There were the kids on the sides of milk cartons when we were kids. And there was definitely like sort of a media hysteria about child kidnapping. It doesn't mean it never happened. It was extremely rare. And generally speaking, most of it occurred with people who were known. So, if there's a divorced parents and one of the parents took the kid, or an uncle or some relative. It doesn't make it any less scary, but it was the actual risk for the stranger, and the thing that people were most worried about was actually very an infrequent and almost a never event. And likewise, when we're looking at these Child Protective Service cases, there are things you worry about because you're thinking, well, now I can't leave my child in their car seat, they're sleeping or whatever. I'm going to just run and get a gallon of milk and come back out. It's 60 degrees out. The windows even roll down a little bit, let's say. There's no risk to my child for being in a car that's locked, a toddler. But now you have to think twice about this. I remember when I was a kid, you were just sort of left the cars and it was not a big deal. Obviously you wouldn't leave a kid out there in unsafe conditions, but now you just think twice. It's in the back of your mind. And, I don't know if that's a good thing because it's inconvenient and it causes disruption in family. But the risks, of course, is that people know that what if your kid got taken away from you? It's kind of like a kidnapping. And to get your kid back, it causes you to expend extraordinary resources, lawyers, evidence, and even if you have the right evidence and you have the right people who are fighting for you, maybe the experts that the state uses just are more convincing to a jury. And so you may be completely innocent but lose your children. Now, this is to say, of course, probably most evidence instances when CPS takes a child are appropriate. In fact, I think they probably are. But what is the process to protect yourself if they're wrong? And I think, when you look at the American judicial process, we have the criminal process, which says you have to be innocent beyond a reasonable doubt. And the reason for that is we've decided we'd rather have a system that allows people to go free than to lock up people who are unfairly accused of crimes. It's on balance going to allow more people to walk, using the term, than to people who aren't. But we have recognized that your freedom and the ability for you to live your life as you want is more important and a greater value to us than locking too many people up. That's not always the case. Other countries have different sorts of legal standards, but that is our standard, at least for criminal. Civil cases is entirely different. But for the criminal and locking up someone and taking away their freedom, we treat, so that you actually expect to let people who are guilty to be felt to be innocent, or at least not proven not guilty. And that's the standard we have. It is not the case in CPS. And there are probably even far less checks and less evidentiary sort of methods that are employed. And so we're going to discuss that. And so I think this is a great discussion. It does involve medical personnel because we're often the ones who are either forced to report this through the mandatory reporter laws, or the ones who are making the initial claims that there was abuse. And so what is the process for it? What happens when things go sideways? You have a bad actor, either through CPS or perhaps one of the physicians making the call. What happens? And so that's the discussion today. It's kind of scary, but my hope is that we think a little bit more clearly about the implications of when we pass laws. It's very easy to get thrown off by headlines and see something like, someone's for kids or against kids. How could you vote against this that's protecting kids? When we're not thinking about the fact that sometimes in order to protect kids, we have to not protect them, in the sense that making it easier to remove kids from a family may actually be detrimental to children, because in general, there'll be more kids taken away from families. That means potentially there are more people who are innocent, who are found guilty, and they are separating children from a family can be very traumatic. If we're talking about cases can last weeks, months, even years, and that cannot be good for the development of a child, for your marriage, for the cohesion of your family. And so, anyway, I think those are things we just need to keep in mind. Well, this is kind of a long introduction. I also want to apologize. I am recovering from the flu. I actually tried to reschedule this interview, but it was going to be like a month and a half, and I thought it was really important. It was actually timely because there's a vote coming up in Washington, in Olympia, which hopefully this will provide a little bit of background and advocacy for Dr. Al-Agba as she makes her play to try and temper the legislative's intentions. But I soldiered on, and so I tried to cut out most of the coughing. God bless Big Pharma, and I will say that in all honesty, with Tamiflu, it turned me around. I had thought in the beginning of the morning that there was no way I could do the interview. By the evening, I could do it and just kind of got through it. So my voice is still a little bit funny, but I appreciate your patronage. If you want to find the show notes, find out more about Dr. Al-Agba, you go to theparadox.com/081. I'd encourage you to stop your podcast player right before this episode begins. Leave a written review on your podcast player. I'd really appreciate that. I always appreciate 5 stars. It's always better than anything else. Again, and if you're not subscribing, please subscribe. It costs nothing, and that way you don't miss any of these exciting episodes that come out on a usually weekly basis. So again, without further ado, a curious case of child abuse with Dr. Al-Agba. Enjoy. Welcome. This is Dr. Eric Larson. I'm here with my new friend, Dr. Niran Al-Agba. I'm doing my best to get your name right. She's at Silverdale Pediatrics in Silverdale, Washington, which is just right across the bay from Seattle. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely.
And we want to talk a little bit today about, well, you're sort of a prolific writer in some ways for someone who's as busy as you are, because I think you're a mom and you're a full-time pediatrician, and you do a lot of writing on the side. So
I'm actually a part-time pediatrician, if that makes anybody feel better. So just 9 to 2.
My wife's a part-time pediatrician too, and I think she only works like 33 hours a week or something.
I'm more like 22.
Okay, well that's a little bit more part-time-ish, so that's good.
Yeah.
And you're in practice with your father, is that correct?
No, I was for 16 years. He passed away about 2.5 years ago, actually.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Well, that's okay. So I was solo actually for since that time. And then I finally found somebody that is a pediatric nurse practitioner who went to a brick and mortar school and has done many years of schooling, which is great. And she joined me about 9 months ago. So it's kind of taken the load off a little bit and made my life a little bit more manageable.
Oh, I'm sure. Did you, we were talking before we started, you mentioned that you actually went to Michigan State for your undergraduate back in my end of the woods.
I did.
But did you know right away that you want to be a doctor, just like your dad? Is that your thinking?
I did. I did. I apparently at 5 told my dad I was born to be a doctor, as a fact. And I used to go with him to the nursery at the hospital here locally, the hospital I was born in. And I used to sit in the nursery and go see the babies. And I think I always really enjoyed it. My grandfather was also a family doc, so I'm a third generation physician, primary care physician. And so I do kind of feel like it was always in my blood.
It's funny because we could never get any of our kids interested in medicine. Not that I pushed it, but they had zero interest in like even wearing a scrub hat or mask. I bring stuff home just kind of to play with when they're little. No interest at all. It was really kind of funny. People always ask me.
I really think it's either in you or it's not. You just sort of have the desire to do it or not.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely true. And so I don't push them. I think I've always found it funny because people always ask me, I'm like, yeah, my kids have had like less than zero interest. Like my wife talks about these kids who come to her office dressed like Doc McStuffins and, whatever. And they do the exam on their little sister while they're, along with my wife. I'm like, yeah, our kids have that's just not them at all.
2 of my 4 are interested. So we'll see where that goes.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk to you about a recent article you wrote, or I guess semi-recently, about the child abuse issue. And why don't you kind of give us background on the actual issue that you wrote about?
Well, it's an interesting story, actually, and it happened about 2 years ago now. I sort of sat on it because I thought it was such an unusual situation. I had a little child who had become injured at daycare, basically, and I was suturing the forehead of the child. And we had to hold the child down, and Dad helped do that. And everything went fine. And about a week later, when they came to get the stitches out, the mom had asked me about a bruise kind of on the hip area. And it was a really small, the size of maybe 2 matchsticks, and it had like 3 lines across. And I just looked at it. I remember glancing at it and just saying, no, that's a typical bruise. And then the next thing I knew, CPS had been called by the daycare. And to be honest with you, at first I thought the daycare was just covering their bases or covering their CYAing, basically, because they had let the kid get injured. So I thought, well, maybe they're just trying to sort of, deflect and blame the parents for something else. And then basically CPS wouldn't let it go. And the family retained a lawyer because one of the parents is involved in healthcare. And I guess CPS had threatened one of the parents saying, your license could be in jeopardy if you don't comply with us. And obviously this is something that is not unique across the country. We're now learning CPS has a lot of things that they're doing and overstepping the law. And so they threatened one of the parents, and the parent said, well, I'm getting a lawyer. I'm not going to talk to anyone about this. And so the lawyer had called me and said, hey, what did you think? And I explained that I thought it was a normal bruise. I don't even understand how anyone could think it was a handprint, which is what I later found out an abuse doctor had said it was. And so I provided a letter saying, this is not abuse. This in no way indicates abuse, et cetera. And for whatever reason, this case ended up being what's considered founded. And CPS came to talk to me, and they were pretty combative, which I thought was interesting. And I explained, I said, I'd stake my license on the fact this isn't abuse. I don't understand what's going on here. And the whole thing was so strange. The CPS worker had told me that this Dr. Woods, who now NBC has reported on pretty extensively, was an abuse doctor, and that she had said it was a handprint. And I had inquired about whether this doctor had ever seen the child, and she hadn't. What the doctor used as information to say it was abuse, and she had used a picture, a very small picture of the bruise. So you couldn't size it, you couldn't do dimensions, really understand even how it fit on the child. And I thought it was so strange because I've never had CPS completely disregard the primary care physician's opinion before.
Yeah.
And so at the time I thought, well, there's no way a real doctor would believe that this is a handprint. Something doesn't compute. So I asked CPS, do you know whether this doctor has training in abuse? And they really don't care. And they later in their report, I now have all the documents, they later in the report said that I don't think they use real doctors. So her answer or understanding of my question wasn't about fellowship training or residency training. She was basically trying to make me look like a quack, saying that I don't believe they use doctors, so that I was discredited. It was really interesting. And so it turns out I called Marybridge in Tacoma, and I got this doctor on the phone, and I asked, do you have fellowship training? Now, Dr. Woods really wouldn't answer that question. She kind of got a little bit upset and said she had 14 years of experience. Now, that 14 years of experience, actually, she told CPS, which is in the documentation. She shared that she had told me that. So when I'm telling you that she said this, it's actually backed by paperwork and legal documentation. That this isn't like a he said or she said, she said. She actually told CPS that she told me she has 14 years of experience. So he didn't answer the question. And then what's interesting is she went to the CMO of Marybridge and told them that I had threatened to sue her. So that's the first time I started to wonder if something was a little bit funny, because I've really never had this kind of experience where, you call, you ask someone's background, and like her staff wouldn't tell me what her education was or where she'd had her training. And it turns out, basically, she didn't have any training. She did a pediatric residency, and she finished in 2010 or 2011. And so she had the same training I did. She did no fellowship in child abuse. And her 14 years of experience, actually, she was including her medical school training.
I was going to say, I bet medical school, yeah.
Yeah, but that's so strange to me. I don't know that I would say I've been working with abused children for 14 years, because really medical school doesn't involve a lot of abused children. I mean, we do basic sciences, especially at USHIS, which is the Uniform Services Medical School, which is where she attended. They are not hitting the ground running doing child abuse training from the very beginning. They're doing basic sciences, they're doing clinical work in all the fields. And, then we pick a sub-internship, let's say our fourth year, and then we do a residency in a specialty of our choice. For me, that was pediatrics. And actually for Dr. Woods, that was pediatrics as well. So that's probably when she really got her experience. So she had really had maybe 3 years of residency training. And then we can't find any work history for her. I've tried. I have part of her resume. And it looks like she was sort of maybe working in various clinics, but that documentation really hasn't been provided. But she certainly hasn't done an abuse fellowship. And in addition, she hasn't been certified in abuse either. So what you have in a nutshell is you have CPS basically not liking the answer of the primary care physician because they wanted to find abuse. And then they're paying another person who has the same training as the primary care physician to give them a different answer. And then they're going in and they're basically making cases founded based on bad advice or bad or uninformed physicians or physicians who don't understand kind of what they're doing, basically incompetence. So, and they contract with the physicians in this state. So so CPS has a direct contract with Dr. Woods. Basically, they're paying her to find abuse. And of course, what NBC has now uncovered is that she's removed children from homes. And then courts are finding out that she's not providing facts to support it. She's basically at times being dishonest and been unable to back up those facts. And they're giving kids back to their families, rightfully so. And so that's dangerous. And what's weird is I experienced this. I mean, basically the family, they did a founded case, but they did not remove the children from the home. And I basically had said to their family lawyer, look, I'll stand up on any court anywhere and say, I will stake my license on the facts. This is not abuse. Well, I think the prosecutor in our local area knew that wasn't going to play well. Like they aren't going to get a conviction with one of the doctors standing up that hard. And it's interesting, the family lawyer asked me at one point, do you socialize with this family? Are you friends with them? And honestly, I've never socialized with them. I'm not friends with them. They're very lovely people, of course. But I don't have a relationship outside of my office with them. And she said, I've never seen a physician stand up this hard. And I just felt really strongly that they were being wrongly accused. And to me, there's nothing worse than being a parent and being wrongly accused of abuse, and then having some person who doesn't really have the competence to know what a handprint is versus what isn't, then saying it's abuse.
Yeah.
And then the police backed me. The police said, we don't even understand how any medical provider could say this is a handprint. It doesn't look anything like a handprint.
There's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I guess, so to start back of the story, this is a 2-year-old, a very small child, right? So when you're saying dad's restraining the child, there's no reasoning with the 2-year-old. I always tell parents this when I'm, putting a 2-year-old to sleep. I say, we're just bigger and they're more, they're more of us. And you can sometimes bring them back and they might be okay. But essentially they're still 2 and they're just going to do what they want to do.
Yeah. And to stitch, I had to put in 4 or 5 stitches in the forehead, and I'm not an anesthesiologist, and I'm not going to I'm not going to,
No.
conscious or something. They were linear. It was interrupted, sutures, individual. And I have a little papoose, but 2-year-olds can get their arms out of the papoose device. So I needed a little bit of extra restraint on her arms. And so obviously that's what we did. And they when they initially called it in, they said there was a bruise on each arm and then this one on the hip. Well, we probably caused the bruise on each arm, and those ended up being like non-issues when they took pictures.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you have someone here who, again, so for those who are not clear, CPS is Child Protective Services. And so this is the agency, I think most states call it the CPS, that is charged with protecting children from abuse, whether that's not feeding your kid to actually, physically abusing them or something like that. And they're the ones who will do an investigation, and they'll take kids out of homes, put in foster care and things like that.
And honestly, they do I wouldn't say they do a good job most of the time. I think they do a fair job most of the time. They try to take into account the doctor's opinion, the family. They look at the family. They try to do a thorough job. And what was so different about this, I've been practicing almost 19 years, and this single case stood out to me as really concerning because they basically, CPS disregarded anything that I said. They tried to discredit me in their write-up of our interview, which I thought was so strange. And then they went with a doctor's opinion who never saw the patient. This is not okay.
No, I found that, and I don't think I even picked up on that when I read the piece that you wrote, that she actually never even examined the child.
No, she didn't.
It's very strange that she would come to a conclusion that there's, because again, a picture.
She's paid for that conclusion.
Well,
that's what's so amazing.
Yeah, that's the thing that's really disturbing about this. I think you could say that people who take on this job, it's a thankless job, right? Because generally,
it is.
You're doing, no one wants you to be there when it comes to the families, because, if they did abuse a kid, they obviously don't want you to take the kid away from,
of course, it is a thankless job. And we need our pediatric abuse specialists. There's no question that many of them go into this. It's a labor of love. It's very hard, trying, probably emotionally difficult work as well. And my hat is off to the abuse pediatricians that I've worked with over my long career. But this one, there's something different. And I think it's happening in other places around the country, which is what's concerning.
Yeah, well, you've seen, and I don't know if you're familiar, but there are cases in the South. I know there are a number of people who do forensic work for police agencies, and they will find evidence when there's not really evidence. Either they doctor them, no pun intended, or they'll sort of claim certainty when there's not certainty in some sort of
Correct.
Evidence.
And that's the biggest problem, is where we're stating certainty when science doesn't back up that claim. And I think that's really concerning.
Yeah, right. And I think, the message from that is, again, most forensic work is probably on the up and up, and it's, very good. But you have these bad actors, and again, I think most people go into it for the right reasons. And maybe even this Dr. Woods thinks she's doing the right thing.
I'm sure she does.
Well, not necessarily, but we'll assume she does. We'll give her the benefit of the doubt.
Okay.
Because I think, you definitely are encouraged if you are under the employ of someone to find whatever it is that you're employed to do. And I know those forensics people who, sent people to their death on death row. I think it was like in Alabama or Mississippi. there is definitely, an incentive to be the person who's always the one that the police agency always calls, because you're the one who gets them what they want.
Right.
You get their suspect or something like that. And for CPS, on some level, they probably don't seek out abuse, but there's abuse around, and they probably want people who are going to be able to give them, the 100% sure this happened, or or they're going to be able to testify and be credible. And those are the people they're going to, if you're someone who doesn't find any abuse ever, well, they're not going to pay you. And I mean, there's an implicitly somewhere there is, there's a quid pro quo, I suppose, in some ways,
Yeah.
right?
And to me, that's really concerning, because again, in this country, we're innocent until proven guilty. And I know that doesn't always sit well when we're talking about child abuse. But imagine the damage that is done if someone is innocent, but yet judged as guilty using false science, and then has their children removed. And then the courts overturn it a year later, you get your children back. But my God, look at the damage that was done.
Yeah. And, you think about take a year away for your kids during their development. I mean, the amount of trauma that causes, even if they're, even if they're with you and you have court order people like in attendance with you, to when you're visiting your kids. I mean, that's just a terrible thing. So my wife has a pretty standard practice here in Grand Rapids, mm-hmm. and she had a case that was in many ways very similar to yours. One of her patients was an infant and was out in public. Now, I won't try to give too many details, but was injured, and it was witnessed. In fact, it was witnessed, ironically, by a pediatric intensivist who happened to be sort of in the area. Right. So, everyone's kind of worried, and the pediatric intensivist goes up to the baby and says, "Yeah, baby looks fine. I think everything's okay." But it'd probably be a good idea to go to the urgent care or some sort of like an ER sort of thing, just to make sure everything's okay, because, baby looks okay.
Never know. Yeah.
Don't know. Right. So they go to the emergency room, and the doc looks at them and says, "Yeah, I think everything's fine. If anything comes up, come back, So 2 days later, they come because they noticed the child got struck in the head with an object. And then a couple days later, a bruise or so, like a big bump, appeared on the contralateral, the other side of the head, that was not injured. And so, of course, there was a doctor at the Children's Hospital who said, "Well, this is absolutely abuse, without a doubt, because there's no mechanism for this injury." And it took my wife somewhat Herculean efforts after probably like a month, where the CPS took the kid away. And I mean, my wife got neurosurgeons. She got all these people to come and testify, which is a basic, you can look up. And if you get especially when you're young, if you get an injury to one side of your head, you will get what we would call the contracoup. You get sort of an occurrence on the other side of the head, sort of a cyst can sort of appear, and that's normal from trauma, just from your brain rattling around in your head. And so this is a little bit of research, you could figure this out. I mean, you could, especially if you had a witness event, right? I mean, you had every reason to think that it wasn't. And so I think this family was fairly lucky, but they still had to have I think it was like their parents ended up with the kids for a while, and they could just go with someone, visiting with them to actually see their kid and their baby. I mean, it's pretty crazy, but I mean, this stuff can happen. And it's like you said, it's probably like your worst fear as a parent, right? Just like losing your kids first.
I think so. And what's even more scary is if, people come to us, and they have to be able to trust us. And, people come to us when they need help with an injury that their child sustained. And again, kids, I mean, gosh, they get injured all the time. And what's so strange to me is this, in the case of my patient, it wasn't even an injury we're not even talking about a broken bone. We're talking about a bruise. One tiny bruise.
Right. And one that if you saw it in person, you'd say, well, it's so tiny that there's no way it could be.
I mean,
right.
The other parent happens to be in a career where they were able to do a dimensional analysis, and you could easily prove it was not a handprint of a small female adult or a small male adult. And so if the parent can do that, you would think that the abuse physician can do that. And then that's what they should be doing. And to me, that was what was so disappointing. And then on top of it, CPS just jumped on board.
Yeah, I mean, I think, CPS, the CPS person is, I think, mainly they're social workers who
Yes.
get their undergrad in social work in the university. And so their expertise is not medicine, and you wouldn't expect them to be experts in that. You'd expect them to defer
But I
to
would
physicians.
suspect them to be honest. And what I found this time is that the caseworker was dishonest. And that's what
sure.
concerned me. And that's the thing. It was like they were in cahoots. And actually what ended up happening is a judge overturned their decision. So the family appealed it through the state. The state said, no, we still believe it's founded. And then an administrative judge, someone who has a brain, frankly, and has like a basic IQ that can function, read the information and goes, no way, this isn't a founded case. And they simply overturned it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's appalling.
Yeah. And the scary thing about the whole process, as you said, our jurisprudence system is set on the fact that you're innocent until proven guilty.
Mm-hmm.
With this process, it's not that way.
No, and
assumed
it has
guilty.
to be.
And some level you could say, well, it makes sense. If you think that someone's actually beating their kid or something, you shouldn't say, well, we're just going to, investigate some further, and potentially that puts the kid at risk. But the risk probably is greater for ripping kids out of homes when maybe it's not justified. And I feel like that's sort of the burden of proof should be on the prosecutors or the CPS in this case. And the scary thing about this, of course, is that the state, and I'll use that not just like a state, but the government, they defer to their own people more than any sort of outside opinion. It takes, again, like Herculean efforts to overturn these things, and you have to hire lawyers and do all this thing to sort of prove your innocence and get your kid back. It seems like the system's backwards.
Exactly. And what's so strange to me, I will read you from the report the reason they went with her decision, and that's what's amazing. This is literally from the head manager, or the case manager overseeing the supervisor's review over the social worker, saying there is a MedCon report, which is what Dr. Woods put together, that shows it was non-accidental injury that could be a handprint. So they're saying her report says it's abuse and it's a handprint. The MedCon report was provided by a physician with extensive training and experience in regard to child abuse and neglect. And here's what's scary. She didn't have extensive training. She doesn't have extensive experience. And what Meredith keeps coming out and saying is, she's seen thousands of children. There is no evidence that she's seen thousands of children. There's nothing they can show us. And she hasn't really been practicing in that job very long. She's been in it maybe a year. So again, everybody is able to kind of keep passing the buck. And if we're not going to verify if the experts we're using are properly trained or thoroughly trained or knowledgeable enough to tell whether a handprint is a handprint or not, then we really shouldn't be contracting with them. The state shouldn't be setting up a contract with them to diagnose abuse.
Yeah, that's a real problem. And when people are disingenuous about their the extent of their training, like you said, she said she had 14 years of experience. She included medical school. Maybe she had a pediatric rotation where she saw a kid who was abused.
Right,
or,
maybe.
Like I remember I saw one when I was in medical school where I saw a kid who was, one of those kids who does failure to thrive, right? It's because parents aren't feeding them adequately. You can never really know exactly why. But anyway, so probably saw that. I think there's a shaken baby maybe once that we saw. But for the most part, you just don't, you don't have to, you certainly couldn't call it 4 years of experience. And then to say you've seen thousands of patients, well, she probably has seen thousands of patients, but maybe that's during training, right?
Right.
Because,
right.
And it's not like, I understand, and I know someone, one of my colleagues, her husband was a CPS worker and finally left. He was just kind of frustrated with the process. But they are definitely, from a case standpoint and trying to keep, they have more to do than they can really handle. And I think that's probably the case in most of these agencies, that they don't have the resources to do sort of all that they want to do. But I'm pretty certain that this physician is not like swamped and has so many patients seen with abuse that, don't have time to do a thorough exam. And there's just no way that's possible. There's no way there are that many cases of abuse coming in every day. Well,
if there are that many cases of abuse coming in and you don't have enough time to see a patient, then basically you shouldn't be rendering a decision. So then it should go back to the primary care physician for the decision about whether or not it's abuse. Basically we have the same training, except I have way more experience seeing patients, not abuse patients, but patients over my career. I mean, we have the exact same training.
And the big difference too here is the family, right?
Of course.
And I think you absolutely, there are people who can be sociopaths and can hide it well and pull it off. But for the most part, the families, right? I mean, my wife texts me all the time. She has some family calling with a fever, and she's like, "Yeah, this is no big deal." Or she has some moms calling with a fever, and she's like, "Oh, they must be really sick because this, they only call in when it's, she kind of knows the families. And so
absolutely.
And you kind of know what they're like, and you have a feel for what their home life is. Again, people can put on a show and they could.
And how about we know the history? So what's amazing about this case is nobody cared to get the details of the history. There were sloppy facts in the history that CPS provided to Dr. Woods that she made a ruling on. So, the daycare had made a mistake and said that the parents' stories differed. Now, neither parent spoke with the daycare. So someone at the daycare was either lying or they embellished or whatever. That story got the CPS, which then got passed to Dr. Woods. So what's amazing is Dr. Woods never bothered to get the history. I mean, I guess maybe they don't have time for that. So she is under the impression that the parents had different stories, whereas I talked with both parents. I knew exactly what the stories were. So again, and you can see where in the report it went sideways, where like one daycare person sort of embellished and said one thing or another was the fact. And it wasn't. It turns out they never spoke to that person.
Yeah.
So again, it's these strange mistakes that, I mean, as physicians, we were taught to get a history and then to do a physical and then come up with a plan. And to tell you the truth, even worse than this, I lost a child to abuse recently, and the police have never even contacted me at all. Dr. Woods is all over it. They don't care anything else other than Dr. Woods. They're just going to go with her. And what's amazing to me is this is unheard of. I had a pretty bad abuse case, that permanently damaged a child about 10 years ago. And actually, it was my father's, to be honest with you. He was the primary care doc. He went to court. He testified in criminal court. He was involved. I mean, he was the expert. And I don't know why all of a sudden I think CPS is just deciding that they are tasked with this job of pulling children from homes, and they're going to do it as efficiently and as expediently as they can. And what's even worse is the Senate in this state, in Washington State, has passed a law giving CPS more ability to remove children from the home without due process, basically without a court order.
Absolutely right. I mean, giving anyone that sort of power is dangerous because it can be abused either intentionally or unintentionally. And in all fairness, I don't think it's intentional on behalf of CPS. I can't imagine that any person that's working in the abuse field or is involved with children or child abuse would be doing it intentionally. I absolutely believe it is they're doing it unintentionally. But what's scary is once they do it, it's like you're in this swirling toilet bowl and you can't get out of it. And if you look at it from a public policy standpoint, from the CPS's, so if you look at public choice, maybe is a better way of putting it. From CPS, what are their incentives? And so for Child Protective Services, their incentives are to not, for any government agency, it's not to get bad PR, right? Because as soon as there's like, let's say an abuse case occurs and said, well, they called CPS 3 times and CPS never investigated, right? That is CPS's worst nightmare because that's going to cause someone to get suspended. I mean, most people in government don't lose their jobs, but something will happen to people and their careers will be ruined or whatever. And so they're much more likely to find abuse, see abuse, and just be overly cautious because the cost to them professionally is far greater to miss a case that may have occurred than to break up some families. They don't care as much. I mean, they probably would care if you talk to them. They'd say, "Well, we absolutely care to do the right thing," but their incentives are lined up so that they're incentivized to just to find abuse.
Correct, and that's what I realized going through this experience is they basically made a decision about this family. And they said, this bruise, this doctor says it's a handprint, never saw the patient, doesn't have a history, story doesn't matter. So she says abuse, so therefore it's abuse. Now we just have to prove it's abuse and move on to the next case. And I'm standing in the middle going, this isn't abuse. Like, what's wrong with you people? And the police are saying, I don't understand what the providers are talking about. It's not a handprint. So the police and I are pretty well aligned on this, I think using common sense. And CPS is like, nope, don't confuse us with the facts. We don't want facts. We just want what this one doctor who has no training tells us, and then we can close this case, say it's abuse, and move on to the next case. And that's what this felt like. And then now by law, to give this group of state agency, basically, even more power, to me is frightening. And I guess what my concern is, what I would like to see is I would like to see an ability for a family to get a second opinion, or for CPS to be required to get a second opinion, especially if two doctors differ. So I differed, in my opinion, from Dr. Woods. We have equal training. We have I have, I think, more experience in life, obviously, and seeing patients, but really with equal training, equal board certification. Okay, so we disagree. So a third physician with better experience in abuse should have been brought in and asked for their opinion. They should have had to see the child, examine the child, obtain a history, just like most doctors do, and then render a decision. And I think that if we passed legislation that allowed for something like this, then CPS wouldn't be getting bad PR. And actually, Dr. Woods may have learned something, that he really has a lot to learn about children, accidents, the abuse field in general. And then that would be good for her at the same time.
2-year-olds fall all the time. I mean,
yes, they do.
They get bumps, their heads, bruises, and all the time just doing dumb things. Or like what happened to our kids, every single one of them, they suddenly grow to a certain height and they hit their head on that countertop on the island that they used to walk under, and so,
accidents happen, and that's part of what our training helps us differentiate. I mean, there's quite a few things. If you examine a child and they have all these fractures in their rib cage, or they have a missed, skull fracture, or other kinds of unusual breaks, then obviously that makes more sense. This kid had a bruise. I mean, another family profiled by NBC locally, Woods was accusing them of medical child abuse. The child was a preemie. And actually, again, the courts overturned the decision by CPS and Woods to take the child, and they gave the children back to the parents. And it turned out that she'd falsified all this information.
That kind of brings me to the next point here, and it's one I've thought about actually recently, more the last few years. It's a whole notion of mandatory reporters, and for those people who are not aware, I think pretty much to the extent to all healthcare workers now, that almost every state now has this law that you're what's called a mandatory reporter, which means if you suspect abuse, even if you suspect it but aren't certain, that you are required by law, your license is at stake, to report that. Now, it's hard to prove, what's in your mind if you didn't really think there was any abuse. It'd probably be very difficult for them to take away your license, but it certainly drilled into you that you are what's called a mandatory reporter. And I feel like, sometimes you're forced to do things which maybe in your better interest is like, well, I'm 100% sure this family didn't do it, but these injuries are suspicious. And if someone else found out about that, I didn't report it, I could get in trouble. I mean, I know that does happen. And I wonder if the mandatory reporting law is actually even necessary.
Well, it's an interesting question, because I think the bottom line is we are supposed to use our judgment. And I recently had a case where a child had a fractured clavicle, actually, and the mom had held the child's hand, and the child dropped to the ground suddenly. And so, snapped their clavicle. And they were reasonably, I can't remember the age, but the injury made a lot of sense. And then someone else called CPS on the mom. And so she assumed it was us, came back, wanted to talk about it. And I explained to her that I always tell people when the child, when I'm going to call CPS.
Yeah.
And so, in a nutshell, it ended up being her friend who later said, well, I mean, I just thought I was supposed to call as a mandatory reporter. And I thought at the time, that isn't really, that's not true. If you reasonably suspect the injury is related to abuse or someone's hurt the child on purpose, you call CPS. Now, that's not a bruise. That's not a clavicle fracture, since that's a very common fracture. That's not a buccal fracture of the forearm, so the most common injury in children. Those in general are not uncommon injuries. There are a couple things, though, that we do call on. Someone who doesn't seek care for 2 weeks, let's say, and the arm is broken. To me, that's a red flag. And I have called before, and I've told the family, look, this makes me uncomfortable. I'm going to call. I've actually had a radiologist misread a skull fracture on a baby. And when I went in, I was looking at the CT going, this is a suture. This was in my first year of practice. And I said, that's a suture. That is not a skull fracture. And lo and behold, it was this unusual finding it's not that common in babies, but basically it was kind of like a metoptic suture. And the thing is, we did this full abuse workup on this kid who basically just had a suture that hadn't closed yet. And so, again, we need to be thorough and we need to use good judgment. And I think as long as we can defend that judgment, then you can't take away a license for someone who didn't call when a person fractured their clavicle. Now, if you miss 11 rib fractures, okay, that are in various stages of healing, okay, that's a little bit of a different situation. But a singular clavicle fracture, a singular forearm fracture, we don't have to call on this stuff. And I know there's a case in, I think it's Wisconsin, actually, through Children's Hospital of Wisconsin, Dr. Cox, who's actually been arrested and is going to stand has criminal charges against him. And it sounds like his pediatrician, he came in saying he'd fallen asleep with the baby in his arms and thought he had rolled over on the baby. And that pediatrician called. And I've wondered, I don't know that pediatrician, I don't know the details. But again, sometimes I wonder, did we really need to call? Did we have a reasonable suspicion that the person was beating the child? And look at what's happened. This is a pediatric ER physician who's lost his job and was arrested and the 1-month-old child was taken from the family.
Yeah, it strikes me, much as I believe that CPS probably has every incentive to bring more cases, like I mentioned, that the mandatory reporting law, and even if you don't really truly believe that your license is at stake, because again, it's very hard to prove that someone knew something and they failed to report it.
Correct.
But I think that sort of is drilled into you so much that if you're almost looking for trouble, right?
Right.
And it causes an over-reporting. And I think most people, both healthcare workers, when they report it, they think, well, it'll be, I'm reporting it, but it's just, a suspicion, and they'll adjudicate it properly. And if it's not, then the person will be fine. And but I think,
isn't what's happening now.
Well, right, exactly. That's the problem, right? And so, again, most of the time, I think probably people have the proper suspicions and kids are appropriately removed. Parents are living in a car and they're not feeding their baby and they're, strung out on heroin or something for a week at a time or something like that. Those kids should be taken out of their, home or whatever. Those are pretty easy cases, but it seems it's these weird ones that spring up all the time. And you're like, it doesn't make, like your case is not, unfortunately, it's not that unique, right? I mentioned my wife had one, and you read about these all the time. And I think, we have to have deference to protecting kids, but in some ways, you almost wonder if you should have greater deference to protecting the family.
Right. Well, we have to have deference for due process. Really, that's what's missing in this whole equation is we are not investigating properly. We're not collecting facts in an unbiased manner. We're basically asking a doctor with no training in abuse. So tell me how this is abuse. And they're stating, oh, well, it's 100% intentional. And I can tell you because they looked at some of her cases. She's a great example. She says the family demeanor, the demeanor of the parents was not upset enough that I'm going to believe their story. Now, come on, that isn't science. That's conjecture. And that's how we lose due process in this country. And this is a real straightforward example of where that's happening. And what's interesting is I think because people think they're saving children by arresting parents wrongly, removing children from the home incorrectly, so they think, well, due process isn't all that important, right? Who cares about due process? Well, there's a reason. There's a reason we have that. There's a reason it's a legal doctrine. There's a reason that we have it as a basis of how we administer justice in this country. And really, to be honest with you, the fatal abuse cases that I've seen, those kids, there were no signs of abuse most of the time, and they came in either dead or permanently damaged. So, and I haven't had, thousands of those, but I've had quite a few that have been in my practice where, again, we had it was like a one-time deal. Everything was fine. You see them for their 2-week check or whatever it was. And, by the time they're, let's say 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it is, they come in and they're permanently damaged. And abusive head trauma goes with rib fractures. Obviously, those things are more cut and dried, but we are talking about a bruise. And we're talking about facts that I think really don't warrant removal of due process for families. And I think by granting more and more power to CPS and by granting the ability for CPS to pay their own experts to find abuse, my God, it's like a witch hunt.
Yeah. Well, you're giving them extrajudicial powers, right? You're allowing them to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner all at the same time.
Right. And that's not good.
No, you wouldn't want to give anyone that much power anywhere. And the problem, of course, politically is if you're some legislator and you're presented with a bill to protect kids, well, who's going to vote against that? I mean, because most people, it's a headline. No matter how bad the bill, you have to be quite an extraordinary politician or statesman to say, well, I read the bill and this actually doesn't protect kids as much as it's actually going to harm families. Because people are like, you're a monster. You can imagine that, the political ads with your opponents in 2 years or whenever it is, you're up for re-election. And so they're going to just go along with this. And so, let's say you want to change this. You want to change the law. So you mentioned one thing that you thought it'd be good to have a second opinion, or that you have at least a second physician, examine, maybe knows the family or something like that. What other sort of protections would you have in place if you could ideally rewrite the CPS laws?
Well, if I could rewrite the CPS laws, there'd be a couple of things. First of all, I think we should standardize the process that CPS goes through. It's kind of willy-nilly. If the social worker wants to talk to you, they do. If they don't, they don't. If they want to interview the kids, they can. If they don't, they don't. I mean, again, it should be just like police investigators or detectives have a process they go through where they gather information, they look at the evidence, they evaluate it, and then they formulate a plan or a report. I think CPS should be, they should have guidelines in place how CPS does the workup. And if a worker is super biased for whatever reason, like in this case where the social worker, her name was Robin Dewar, which I can say because it's public record. She was very biased. She didn't like that the family would not let them into the home. She didn't like that the family got a lawyer after she threatened them. And so she was pretty adversarial from the get-go. And she should have been removed and replaced with a social worker who came in with a fresh set of eyes. So again, streamlining the process and making it fair and balanced. Okay, that's one issue. The second would be that it is fine for CPS to contract with an abuse physician. Number one, that abuse physician should have proper training and be vetted properly. So you shouldn't be they shouldn't contract with a random anesthesiologist to be their abuse expert, right? And I'm not insulting anesthesia. I just know you're an anesthesiologist, so I kind of pulled that out as an example. So that person should have proper training, proper certification, and proper experience that's verified. So that would be the second issue. They shouldn't be able to contract with random people off the street, which is basically what they did. Then number three would be the person who is contracted with CPS should have to, number one, examine the child. Number two, talk to the families. Number three, do their own investigative evaluation with a history, physical exam, labs if necessary, and then a assessment and plan or a differential diagnosis or some sort of report that is more than, that sure looks like a handprint. This is not an accident. This is abuse. This is what her report said. It's abuse. It's a handprint from a picture. So that shouldn't be allowed either. Then if they want to also seek the opinion of the primary care, they should be actually mandated to seek the opinion of the primary care physician. So even if a child dies, they shouldn't be able to say, well, we don't really care who was taking care of the kid until they died. We're just going to go with Dr. Wood's opinion. So then mandatory, get the opinion of the primary care doc. And then if the abuse physician that CPS pays and the primary care physician that CPS does not pay and does not have a relationship with, if those two have a difference of opinion, a third physician who is unpaid by CPS yet has the proper background in abuse and certification in abuse to then render an opinion, that person should be consulted. And then all three of those opinions and reports should be submitted into court and a decision should be made. Unless if the child has let's say rib fractures, abusive head trauma. I mean, again, there's probably a list we could go through where safety of the child precludes, being formal through the process, but a bruise doesn't qualify. This accusation of medical child abuse when the child's alive and well doesn't qualify. So again, really tight boundaries about when you can pull a child.
Yeah, I mean, those sound very sensible. And I kind of like actually the second opinion. And there will be some people that say, well, some people don't have a primary care physician, which is true. And so,
that's fine.
And then you although you could say, well, there's probably another physician somewhere, even if the emergency room physician could serve as that, the other opinion. Now, there would be some conflictions there, I imagine, but, I guess that's better than nothing. Have it at least.
It is. And most people, I mean, really, even, and again, I'm only talking about Washington's experience, but most people in Washington do have connection with a primary care physician.
Yeah.
And again, it's not everybody, but we do have a database for immunizations. So if they've ever gotten shots, then they do technically have a primary care physician, even if they haven't been seen in a couple of years. That's still fair to say, let's evaluate this child. And actually, that physician probably wouldn't be as biased. So you'd get kind of a fresh set of eyes on the child.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I think the key is just to having a thorough investigation, and you have people who
Correct.
And I mean, I guess this gets into the other thing. The abuse doctor, it's a fairly new subspecialty in pediatrics.
Yes.
I think it was like only 400 maybe in the whole country, or maybe there's more now. But
no, it's about right, 400.
So that's not many. I mean,
no, it's not.
That most cities won't have one, I guess is probably fair to say. If it's a big enough city, they'll have one or maybe two. So most places aren't going to have that. So is a contract with these other docs who call themselves abuse? And again, I think, you don't have to do a subspecialty in abuse to be good at it. I think, again, you can be sensible, look at injuries and assess people. And, if you can go to extra seminars and, and do extra CME accreditation to try and get better acquainted with types of injuries and stuff. You don't have to do a whole year of stuff.
Absolutely.
I think we overpaper ourselves in medicine. So, but as a general pediatrician, I think you could probably do that, or a family physician, whatever.
Well, and a lot of them do. So actually, a lot of the abuse physicians across the country, and actually every other one in Washington State, so there's 6 total. The other 5 have either what's called grandfathered into the specialty, meaning they've been working in this specialty for, let's say, more than a decade, 20 years.
Right.
So a lot of them actually took the certification exam, and they were certified in abuse when it came out in 2010. And what's interesting is Dr. Woods in court had said she didn't think it was necessary for her to get certification. And in reality, the true answer is I don't believe that she could, because she would have finished a fellowship after 2010, a fellowship she never did. But she would have finished that fellowship after 2010, when it was now required to do a fellowship in order to become certified. So you're right. On one hand, I think experience in the field can be very helpful, but not embellishing your experience. So having real experience working in the abuse field, like a lot of the other specialists across the country, is extremely valuable. And I wouldn't disparage their training in any way, shape, or form. I just happen to be in this weird situation where I have a doctor who isn't really as forthcoming about her background or her education, and it's concerning to me. And I understand a lot of other physicians in the area, they're concerned about their jobs, or they're employed by large institutions, so they can't talk. And I mean, I'm an independent physician. So I love Mary Bridge. I got to be honest with you. It's a wonderful children's hospital. It has wonderful specialists. They've saved countless numbers of children's lives. And I've always had a really wonderful relationship with them. And I still refer to them. I still call their specialists. This one specialist I have real concerns about. And I think in her case, her lack of training is making her make kind of unusual decisions about the chance of abuse. And that's what's concerning to me.
I mean, you're being very kind. I mean, I think it's very safe. Yeah, I think it's very safe to say that, I mean, assuming what you've said is accurate, that this is not a lack of training. This is someone who's just incompetent or,
she's
malicious.
Sloppy. In all honesty, when I talked with NBC News, what I've seen out of all her cases, I've reviewed quite a few. And again, I've said this to NBC News, so I can say it on here. In my opinion, based on my experience with her and my experience reviewing her cases, she's sloppy.
Yeah.
She said a kid who has a feeding tube wolfed down a Happy Meal, and it turns out that wasn't true. She never saw that. She just testified to that in court, and that's a court public record document. There's quite a few examples of things like that. In my case, she said that the parents' stories didn't agree, and that wasn't true either. So she doesn't verify facts, and she's sloppy. There's another example of a case where she called the police because the patient supposedly had a broken leg, and as the police are interviewing the mother, they're like, "Where's your son's cast?" And she said, He didn't break his leg. What are you talking about?
Right.
So that's sloppy. That's just sloppy practice.
Yeah. And, we all know professionals, not just medicine, who are sloppy.
Yeah.
And they're not any good. And that's just, and
the problem is she's contracted with the state and now has control over pulling kids from the home.
Right.
And you got to be careful. Like, you have to back yourself with facts. You have to be thorough. Really important.
And that's why you want to have protections with the law that
Correct.
protect you from people who are sloppy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the more backstops we have, the better. And that's.
And what I'm disappointed about, to be honest with you, is I'm disappointed with the response from the American Academy of Pediatrics and the subspecialty of child abuse, because what a lot of the different court cases are showing, and some of these are in Texas, and obviously you're probably familiar with Mike Hicksonbaugh, who's written many of these articles for NBC. He's sort of on a mission. And a lot of the quotations the doctors are saying in court are, yes, I know that this was 100% intentional to injure this child. And the thing is, what I've said over a lot of these months where I've been answering questions about this case is, our job is to speak to science. Physicians are supposed to say, this is a bruise that looks intentional. This is a bruise that more likely than not was not intentional. We do not have science that says, I know beyond the shadow of a doubt, this was an intentional scald burn, or this was an intentional bruise, or this was an intentional fracture. And I think if we're going to step outside, I think there's some abuse physicians that maybe are overstepping because they want to establish legitimacy of this field, and they're harming the field, the entire field, by doing it this way, rather than saying, I can't tell you what the parent's motivation was here. I feel it's more likely than not it was abuse. Even Dr. Wood's MedCon report on the patient I had said, this is non-transitory. This is abuse. That's not her place. She had no knowledge. She can't even really say that. You can say, I wonder if this is abuse. I'm concerned this is abuse. But those are two different things. And that's a really important nuanced distinction of what I think child abuse pediatricians may be doing wrong, some of them.
This is sort of like the specialty is sort of circling the wagons, and they're protecting
Correct.
themselves.
And that's what I'm disappointed with.
And, you see that in practices and all sorts of professions, right? Like you see in police officers, they're dirty cops, and they'll do anything they can to protect because they don't want, they don't want,
we owe the public more, though. We do. We're in a very unique situation, and we owe the public honesty, transparency. We owe our patients trust until they break it. I mean, again, we're supposed to use our judgment. And
the stakes are so high, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the really it's one thing if you do a bad job landscaping and the landscaper did everything right because whatever. But when it's talking to tearing families apart or putting someone in jail or in death row, I mean, these are serious things, right? We're talking about.
Yes. And people have said to me that, gosh, they don't think the abuse physicians are trying to tear families apart on purpose. And I agree. I do not think abuse pediatricians go into this field to tear families apart on purpose. Of course not. But then we should, if we're going to pull children from a home, we should do it with care, and we should do it when we are sure that it's happening. And we should verify facts. We should investigate facts. We should obtain histories. I mean, we should go back to practicing medicine if we're going to do this. We shouldn't be just quickly looking at a picture online and saying, oh yeah, pull that kid out of the home. I mean, To me, that's appalling. And any physician that's going to behave like that or do that because they're being paid by the state, to me, it's on the border of unethical practice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, unless you're an eyewitness, you can't say with certainty that something happened, right? I mean,
right.
And even eyewitnesses are sometimes wrong. But anyway, I mean, this has been a really interesting discussion, and it's something that, I think, well, as you mentioned, it's coming more to light, and it's going to be a conflict I think we're going to see in more states because it'll start affecting more and more families as there's more power given to these agencies to, again, act as judge, jury, and executioner, and they can, do whatever they want. Where the police don't agree, and still kids are taken out. I mean, it's very interesting that sort of process exists. Well, what's a good place for people to follow more of what you're doing, and anything in particular you want to talk about with the vote coming in Olympia, I guess, right?
Yeah, I actually didn't really understand that the legislators were going to be passing these laws, and it's passed through the Senate. It's a Senate bill to give more power to CPS, and actually it's going to build immunity in for the physicians and other people who pull children from the home. So even if they're wrong, and even if it was on purpose, believe it or not, that's in there, that they're immune from any repercussions from the families that are getting destroyed. So I know my reps pretty well, and obviously this week I'll be contacting them and trying to explain to them where I think there's a problem, and that just, rubber stamping this law is not in the long run going to be good for the families watching the state. So that's what I plan to do. And if people want to follow me, I'm a bi-monthly columnist at the Kitsap Sun, which is a USA Today paper. And then I have my own blog spot, and I think it's connected basically to www.niranalagba.com. And I write for various places, Kevin MD and a few others, thedeductible.com. And anytime I guess I see injustice, I am going to write about it, because that's sort of my shtick. I love my patients. I love what I do. I feel like that the doctor-patient relationship is probably the most sacrosanct or sacred thing that exists when it comes to people getting healthcare and taking care of themselves. And so I tend to really stand up and fight for that. And I felt like this scenario and what happened was really trying to destroy the doctor relationship. And it's unjust, it's unethical. And so as things cross my desk that are like this, I'm going to keep writing about them.
You're a classic pediatrician. You guys are always standing up for injustice and protecting people. I feel I do the same thing, so I'm kind of weird anesthesiologist. I kind of feel the same way about lots of these things. But did I catch you correctly that you said that these physicians will have immunity under the law for what they, so they can't be sued for malpractice or anything like that?
Correct. That's right.
Even if they perjure themselves?
Sorry?
Even if they perjure themselves, lie under oath?
I mean, they have proof that she did that. That's what's so interesting. Although maybe they're assuming she didn't lie. I don't know. She was mistaken under oath. So yeah, what's interesting, I just read it earlier, and it said that these physicians, social workers, and other people that are involved in these cases, even if it's discovered that they didn't do their job correctly, they are immune from prosecution or immune from any other negative consequences if they remove children from the home. And again, I understand from a legislative standpoint that it sounds like a great idea to strengthen protections for children, but this isn't strengthening protections for children. It's strengthening protection for a state agency that doesn't know what they're doing, is incompetent, and gets away with being sloppy. And I think that's really a tragedy.
Well, Dr. Al-Agba, thank you so much. I really appreciate the discussion, and boy,
thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. I hope people managed to get through me dealing with the flu here, but we soldiered on. It was a pleasure.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks for listening to The Paradox. If you like what the doc is doing, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher. And share the show with your friends. Become a supporting listener to get access to special bonuses at patreon.com/theparadox. Show notes can be found at theparadox.com.